Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you'd like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to this newsletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Shady Oak Groves. Tonight, we'll read the next part to the classic children's story Heidi, published in 1881 by Swiss author Johanna Spyri. If you'd like to start from the beginning, you'll find that the very first episode aired on March 8th, 2019. If you'd like to listen to this continuing story in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. In the previous episode, Heidi gets an idea to use the money she received from the Sessemann family to provide soft white bread rolls to the grandmother regularly. She also reads a story to her grandfather, also referred to as the uncle. The story was about repentance, forgiveness, and humility, and it brings the old man a change of heart. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. The next morning found the old uncle standing before the door, looking about him over valley and mountain. A few early bells sounded from below, and the birds sang their morning anthems. Re-entering the house, he called, "Heidi, get up. The sun is shining. Put on a pretty dress, for we are going to church." With Heidi's hand in his, they wandered down together. The nearer they came to the village, the louder and richer the bells resounded. "Oh, grandfather, do you hear it? It seems like a big high feast," said Heidi. When they entered the church, all the people were singing. Though they sat down on the last bench behind, the people had noticed their presence and whispered it from ear to ear. When the pastor began to preach, his words were a loud thanksgiving that moved all his hearers. After the service, the old man and the child walked to the parsonage. The pastor's friendly eyes sparkled, and with many a kind word, he commended the uncle for this change, and, putting his hand on Heidi's curly hair, ushered them out. The door of the parsonage was hardly shut when the whole assembly came forward with outstretched hands and friendly greetings. Great seemed to be their joy at the old man's resolution. Some of the people even accompanied him on his homeward way. When they had parted at last, the uncle looked after them with his face shining as with an inward light. Heidi looked up to him and said, "Grandfather, you have never looked so beautiful." "Do you think so, child?" he said with a smile. "You see, Heidi, I am more happy than I deserve. To be at peace with God and men makes one's heart feel light. God has been good to me to send you back." When they arrived at Peter's hut, the grandfather opened the door and entered. "How do you do, grandmother?" he called out. "I think we must start to mend again before the fall wind comes." "Oh my God, the uncle!" exclaimed the grandmother in joyous surprise. "How happy I am to be able to thank you for what you have done, uncle. Thank you. God bless you for it." With trembling joy, the grandmother shook hands with her old friend. "There is something else I want to say to you, uncle," she continued. "If I have ever hurt you in any way, do not punish me. Do not let Heidi go away again before I can die. I cannot tell you what Heidi means to me." So saying, she held the clinging child to her. "No danger of that, grandmother. I hope we shall all stay together now for many years to come." Brigida now showed Heidi's feather hat to the old man and asked him to take it back. But the uncle asked her to keep it, since Heidi had given it to her. "What blessings this child has brought from Frankfurt," Brigida said. "I often wondered if I should not send our little Peter, too. What do you think, Uncle?" The uncle's eyes sparkled with fun when he replied, "I'm sure it would not hurt Peter. Nevertheless, I should wait for a fitting occasion before I sent him." The next moment, Peter himself arrived in great haste. He had a letter for Heidi, which had been given to him in the village. What an event! A letter for Heidi! They all sat down at the table while the child read it aloud. The letter was from Clara Sessemann, who wrote that everything had got so dull since Heidi left. She said that she could not stand it very long, and therefore her father had promised to take her this coming fall. She announced that Grandmama was coming too, for she wanted to see Heidi and her grandfather. Grandmama, having heard about the rolls, was sending some coffee too, so that the grandmother would not have to eat them dry. Grandmama also insisted on being taken to the grandmother herself when she came on her visit. Great was the delight caused by this news, and what with all the questions and plans that followed, the grandfather himself forgot how late it was. This happy day, which had united them all, caused the old woman to say at parting, "The most beautiful thing of all, though, is to be able to shake hands again with an old friend, as in days gone by. It is a great comfort to find again what we have treasured. I hope you'll come again soon, Uncle. I am counting on the child for tomorrow." This promise was given. While Heidi and her grandfather were on their homeward path, the peaceful sound of evening bells accompanied them. At last they reached the cottage, which seemed to glow in the evening light. Part 2, Heidi makes use of her experience. Preparations for a journey. The kind doctor who had sent Heidi home to her beloved mountains was approaching the Sessemann residence on a sunny day in September. Everything about him was bright and cheerful, but the doctor did not even raise his eyes from the pavement to the blue sky above. His face was sad, and his hair had turned very gray since spring. A few months ago, the doctor had lost his only daughter, who had lived with him since his wife's early death. The blooming girl had been his only joy, and since she had gone from him, the ever-cheerful doctor was bowed down with grief. When Sebastian opened the door to the physician, he bowed very low, for the doctor made friends wherever he went. "I'm glad you have come, doctor," Mr. Sessemann called to his friend as he entered. "Please let us talk over this trip to Switzerland again. Do you still give the same advice, now that Clara is so much better?" "What must I think of you, Sessemann?" replied the doctor, sitting down. "I wish your mother was here. Everything is clear to her, and things go smoothly then. This is the 3rd time today that you have called me, and always for the same thing." "It is true. It must make you impatient," said Mr. Sessemann. Laying his hand on his friend's shoulder, he continued, "I cannot say how hard it is for me to refuse Clara this trip. Haven't I promised it to her, and hasn't she looked forward to it for months? She has borne all her suffering so patiently, just because she had hoped to be able to visit her little friend on the Alp. I hate to rob her of this pleasure. The poor child has so many trials and so little change. But, Sessemann, you must do it," was the doctor's answer. When his friend remained silent, he continued, "Just think what a hard summer Clara has had. She never was more ill, and we could not attempt this journey without risking the worst consequences. Remember, we are in September now, and though the weather may still be fine on the Alp, it is sure to be very cool. The days are getting short, and she could only spend a few hours up there if she had to return for the night. It would take several hours to have her carried up from Ragaz. You see yourself how impossible it is. I shall come in with you, though, to talk to Clara. You'll find her sensible. I'll tell you of my plan for next May. First, she can go to Ragaz to take the baths. When it gets warm on the mountain, she can be carried up from time to time. She'll be stronger then, and much more able to enjoy those excursions than she is now. If we hope for an improvement to her condition, we must be extremely cautious and careful. Remember that." Mr. Sessemann, who had been listening with the utmost submission, now said anxiously, "Doctor, please tell me honestly if you still have hope left for any change." With shrugging shoulders, the doctor replied. Not very much. But think of me, Sessemann. Have you not a child who loves you and always welcomes you? You don't have to come back to a lonely house and sit down alone at your table. Your child is well taken care of. And if she has many privations, she also has many advantages. Sessemann, you do not need to be pitied. Just think of my lonely home. Mr. Sessemann had gotten up and was walking round the room, as he always did when something occupied his thoughts. Suddenly, he stood before his friend and said, Doctor, I have an idea. I cannot see you sad any longer. You must get away. You shall undertake this trip and visit Heidi in our stead. The doctor had been surprised by this proposal and tried to object, but Mr. Sessemann was so full of his new project that he pulled his friend from him into his daughter's room, not leaving him time for any remonstrances. Clara loved the doctor, who had always tried to cheer her up on his visits by bright and funny tales. She was sorry for the change that had come over him and would have given much to see him happy again. When he had shaken hands with her, both men pulled up their chairs to Clara's bedside. Mr. Sessemann began to speak of their journey and how sorry he was to give it up. Then he quickly began to talk of his new plan. Clara's eyes had filled with tears, but she knew that her father did not like to see her cry, and besides, she was sure that her papa would only forbid her this pleasure because it was absolutely necessary to do so. So, she bravely fought her tears and, caressing the doctor's hand, said, "Oh, please, doctor, do go to Heidi. Then you can tell me all about her and can describe her grandfather to me, and Peter, with his goats. I seem to know them all so well. Then you can take all the things to her that I had planned to take myself. Oh, please go, doctor, and then I'll be good and take as much cod liver oil as ever you want me to." Who can tell if this promise decided the doctor? At any rate, he answered with a smile, "Then I shall surely go, Clara, for you will get fat and strong, as we both want to see you. Have you settled yet when I must go?" "Oh, you had better go tomorrow morning, doctor," Clara urged. "She's right," the father assented. "The sun is shining, and you must not lose any more glorious days on the Alp." The doctor had to laugh. "Why don't you chide me for being here still? I shall go as quickly as I can, Sessemann." Clara gave many messages to him for Heidi. She also told him to be sure to observe everything closely so that he would be able to tell her all about it when he came back. The things for Heidi were to be sent to him later, for Miss Rottenmeier, who had to pack them, was out on one of her lengthy wanderings about town. The doctor promised to comply with all Clara's wishes and to start the following day. Clara rang for the maid and said to her, when she arrived, "Please, Tinette, pack a lot of fresh, soft coffee cake in this box." A box had been made ready for this purpose many days. When the maid was leaving the room, she murmured, "That's a silly bother." Sebastian, who had happened to overhear some remarks, asked the physician when he was leaving to take his regards to the little miss, as he called Heidi. With a promise to deliver this message, the doctor was just hastening out when he encountered an obstacle. Miss Rottenmeier, who had been obliged to return from her walk on account of the strong wind, was just coming in. She wore a large cape, which the wind was blowing about her like two full sails. Both had retreated politely to give way to each other. Suddenly, the wind seemed to carry the housekeeper straight towards the doctor, who had barely time to avoid her. This little incident, which had ruffled Miss Rottenmeier's temper very much, gave the doctor occasion to soothe her, as she liked to be soothed by this man, whom she respected more than anybody in the world. Telling her of his intended visit, he entreated her to pack the things for Heidi as only she knew how. Clara had expected some resistance from Miss Rottenmeier about the packing of her presents. What was her surprise when this lady showed herself most obliging, and immediately, on being told, brought together all the articles. First came a heavy coat for Heidi, with a hood, which Clara meant her to use on her visits to the grandmother in the winter. Then came a thick, warm shawl, and a large box of coffee cake for the grandmother. An enormous sausage for Peter's mother followed, and a little sack of tobacco for the grandfather. At last, a lot of mysterious little parcels and boxes were packed, things that Clara had gathered together for Heidi. When the tidy pack lay ready on the ground, Clara's heart filled with pleasure at the thought of her little friend's delight. Sebastian now entered and, putting the pack on his shoulder, carried it to the doctor's house without delay. Chapter 16. A Guest on the Alp. The early dawn was tinging the mountains, and a fresh morning breeze rocked the old fir trees to and fro. Heidi opened her eyes, for the rustling of the wind had awakened her. These sounds always thrilled her heart, and now they drew her out of bed. Rising hurriedly, she soon was neatly dressed and combed. Coming down the little ladder and finding the grandfather's bed empty, she ran outside. The old man was looking up at the sky to see what the weather was going to be like that day. Rosy clouds were passing overhead, but gradually the sky grew more blue and deep, and soon a golden light passed over the heights, for the sun was rising in all his glory. "Oh, how lovely! Good morning, Grandfather," Heidi exclaimed. "Are your eyes bright already?" the grandfather retorted, holding out his hand. Heidi then ran over to her beloved fir trees and danced about while the wind was howling in the branches. After the old man had washed and milked the goats, he brought them out of the shed. When Heidi saw her friends again, she caressed them tenderly, and they, in their turn, nearly crushed her between them. Sometimes, when Barely got too wild, Heidi would say, "But Barely, you pushed me like the big Turk," and that was enough to quiet the goat. Soon Peter arrived with the whole herd, the jolly thistlefinch ahead of all the others. Heidi, being soon in the midst of them, was pushed about among them. Peter was anxious to say a word to the little girl, so he gave a shrill whistle, urging the goats to climb ahead.